Let's begin by examining the situation around the blocking of YouTube. This move had been anticipated for a long time, and many were prepared for it. As a result, various creators started migrating their content to alternative platforms, such as VK Video and RooTube. However, transitions like these take time. So many audiences are still in the process of rediscovering the channels they used to follow. Now, let's move on to the main topic. A country with one of the richest histories and one of the bleakest futures. A land ruled by religious fanatics who ban kites, music, and television. Today, we're talking about Afghanistan, one of the poorest nations in the world. Afghanistan has a deep and complex history. In ancient times, it was part of several great empires, including the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great's empire, and that of Genghis Khan. Yet no single power was ever able to fully control the region, largely due to its mountainous terrain. The difficult geography made it nearly impossible to move large organized armies, resulting in a society made up of independent tribes spread across valleys, a structure that, in many ways, still exists today. Before Islam, Buddhism was the dominant religion in Afghanistan. The famous Bamiyan Buddhas, massive statues carved into rock, were created by Buddhists. These monuments stood for centuries until the Taliban destroyed them after coming to power. Islam arrived in the 7th century with the Arab conquests and quickly spread across the region. In the centuries that followed, Afghanistan became a battleground for empires. It was conquered by Mongols and later became a buffer zone between the British and Russian empires. The British controlled India, while the Russians expanded through Central Asia. Afghanistan stood between them, and each empire sought to dominate it without direct confrontation, using influence and proxy tactics. Afghanistan briefly became a British protectorate, but strong local resistance led to its independence in 1919 under King Amanullah. He attempted to modernize the country, but faced pushback from conservative factions. In 1933, King Zahir Shah took the throne and ruled for 40 years, maintaining relative stability while modernization efforts continued slowly. Interestingly, Afghanistan was the first country to recognize the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in 1922. Long before the USSR became a global power, communist ideology gradually spread in Afghanistan, leading to the 1973 abolition of the monarchy and the declaration of a republic. In 1978, a communist revolution brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan to power, but the regime was unstable and faced strong internal opposition. In 1979, the Soviet Union intervened militarily in an effort to support the faltering government. This triggered a decade-long war marked by enormous casualties and destruction. Afghanistan is one of the world's poorest nations, a condition that has led to significant challenges, including a lack of quality education. During the Soviet invasion and subsequent civil war, international and domestic instability pushed Afghanistan even further into chaos. The Soviet-Afghan War began in December 1979 when the USSR sent troops to stabilize the communist government. Initially, Soviet forces were able to seize major cities, but they encountered fierce resistance from Mujahideen fighters who were supported by the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. The Mujahideen used guerrilla tactics, ambushing Soviet convoys in the mountains and leveraging local support and knowledge of the terrain. One of their most effective strategies was ambushing Soviet convoys by attacking the first and last vehicles, trapping the entire line, and allowing fighters to attack from the surrounding hills. Although many of the Mujahideen were farmers or herders, foreign support, particularly from the US, gave them advanced weaponry like Stinger missiles. These man-portable air defense systems dramatically shifted the balance of power by targeting Soviet helicopters, forcing pilots to operate with extreme caution. After the war, the US bought many of these Stingers back, but some ended up on the black market and in the hands of terrorist organizations. The war lasted for 10 years, and most Soviet soldiers were conscripts, which caused immense public dissatisfaction within the USSR. Despite the Soviet Union's military might, it could not control rural Afghanistan. The war was ultimately considered a failure, and the USSR began its withdrawal in 1989. The consequences were severe. Around 15,000 Soviet soldiers died, and tens of thousands were injured. Economically, the war further strained the USSR's already struggling economy and contributed to growing public unrest. This unrest became one of the factors that weakened the Communist Party and accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. For Afghanistan, the war left deep scars. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, millions displaced, and infrastructure was devastated. Even after the Soviets left, internal conflict continued, evolving into a brutal civil war. During the Cold War, the U.S. had supported radical Islamist groups to fight the Soviets. After the war, some of this support helped lay the foundation for al-Qaeda. Founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden and his allies, al-Qaeda's goal was to create a global Islamic caliphate by overthrowing governments they deemed corrupt and too close to the West. Bin Laden, born in 1957 in Saudi Arabia, came from a wealthy family and became radicalized while studying in university. He joined the Mujahideen during the war and later orchestrated numerous terror attacks, including the September 11th attacks in 2001. He was eventually killed by U.S. forces in Pakistan in 2011. Afghanistan has also been the world's largest producer of opium, the base for heroin. Despite international efforts to curb production, opium remained a major export for decades. Its cultivation grew during the Soviet invasion and Civil War, as it provided a more profitable and drought-resistant crop than traditional agriculture. Armed groups, including the Taliban, financed their operations through the drug trade, often protecting farmers and encouraging continued cultivation. Heroin production involves harvesting opium poppies, collecting their sap, and refining it into raw opium and then heroin. The drug trade has had devastating effects on Afghan society, increasing addiction rates and empowering militant groups. Despite efforts to promote alternative crops, destroy poppy fields, and improve education and healthcare, the economic dependency on narcotics remains a challenge. After the U.S. withdrew in 2021, the Taliban claimed to crack down on the drug trade. However, the problem remains far from resolved. Now let's discuss the Taliban itself, a group classified as a terrorist organization by many countries. The Taliban first rose to power in the 1990s, following the chaos after the Soviet withdrawal. The name Taliban means students in Pashto, referring to young men trained in religious schools in Pakistan. Disillusioned by corruption and lawlessness, they sought to impose strict Sharia law. Their early leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, lost one eye fighting Soviet forces, adding to his mythical reputation. Initially, the Taliban had support from locals desperate for order, but once they took Kabul in 1996, they implemented extremely harsh laws. Women were banned from working or studying and forced to wear burqas that covered the entire body, including the eyes. Music, television, and entertainment were banned, and men were required to grow long beards. Even kite flying was outlawed. The Taliban also gave shelter to terrorist groups, including al-Qaeda, which eventually led to the 2001 U.S. invasion after 9/11. The Taliban was ousted from power, but continued a guerrilla war from hiding. In 2020, the U.S. government began negotiations that led to the withdrawal of foreign troops. By 2021, the Taliban had swiftly regained control of Afghanistan. Many remember the tragic scenes at Kabul airport, where desperate civilians tried to flee by clinging to departing aircraft. Despite promises of a more moderate regime, the Taliban has returned to enforcing extreme policies, especially targeting women. Women are barred from public life, education, and healthcare, as male doctors are forbidden from treating them. Even minor public dress code violations can lead to beatings. While some women attempt to flee, many fear both capture and religious condemnation, as suicide is considered a grave sin in Islam. During their first rule, the Taliban also destroyed priceless cultural heritage. The Bamiyan Buddhas, once the largest standing Buddha statues in the world, were blasted to rubble by the Taliban in 2001. Carved into cliffs in the 6th century, these UNESCO-recognized monuments were attacked as symbols of idolatry. After failing to destroy them with artillery and explosives, the Taliban eventually blew them up from within. In the 21st century, international efforts to rebuild Afghanistan as a democracy largely failed. The country repeatedly fell back into religious extremism and instability. This raises a difficult question. Are some countries simply incompatible with democracy due to deep-rooted cultural and ideological beliefs? Thanks for watching this video until the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hope to see you again soon.